Good morning. Welcome, everybody. We're so happy to have you here with us. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. So I hope you're enjoying your brunch basket. I'm having some water in my mug here. It's great to read in Reading, Literature Berks. Thanks so much for joining us.
Package was great, Amanda. I don't know whose idea it was, but it was beautiful. Really nice.
Thanks. Yeah, Nancy and Carol helped me put that together. So we put the brunch basket in a fake book, so it went with the whole theme. So glad you enjoyed that. I'm going to just wait a couple minutes to let everybody in. If I just ask that you stay muted until the Q&A portion, just so we don't have any extra background noise. Hello and welcome to the second season of Literature Berks. My name is Amanda Hornberger. I'm the program director at the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks and the co-chair of Literature Berks. On behalf of our entire Literature Berks committee, I'm thrilled to welcome you to our special virtual brunch. Literature Berks is a community-wide celebration of books and authors presented by the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks in partnership with the Exeter Community Library, Sinking Spring Public Library, and the Jewish Book Council. I will put a link in the chat to purchase a signed copy of My Wife Said You May Want to Marry Me through our official book vendor, Reads and Company Bookshop. We're happy to support a local independent bookstore, and we encourage you to continue to shop local during this time. Remember that books always make great gifts. I also still have 7 signed copies at the JCC, so if you don't want to order through Reads and Company, I have them at the office, and I'm happy to coordinate to make sure to get that to you. Throughout the event, feel free to type any questions that you might have into the chat function, and we were going to do our best to answer questions at the end of the presentation. Joining us today is Jason B. Rosenthal. He's a lawyer and executive director of a nonprofit organization created in his late wife's name, the Amy Cruz Rosenthal Foundation, which funds child literacy programs and ovarian cancer research. He is also the subject of an essay written by his wife called You May Want to Marry My Husband. Just days before her death, her article appeared in the Modern Love column of the New York Times, went viral, and was read by millions of readers worldwide. His response to Amy's piece, titled My Wife Said You May Want to Marry Me, was published in 2020. Jason now speaks publicly and writes about issues related to processing grief and finding hope and joy amongst the pain. Thank you so much for joining us, Jason.
Good morning. Thank you so much for that introduction, Amanda. And I am going to now share my screen. Oops, not that. All right. Well, good morning, and thank you so much for having me to your community, although it's, of course, virtual. I miss you, and I really regret not being able to travel during the course of publishing this book and in the pandemic, but of course, we prioritize and pivot, and this virtual experience is wonderful, and I'm so honored that you all chose to share your brunch with me this morning. What I'd like to do at this moment is to start my presentation. Let's see, there we go. Okay. So I want to take a moment just to acknowledge where we are, which is 1 year. And I can't believe I'm saying that because my book came out in April and I'm already preparing for the paperback to come out, and all of that has taken place in the course of this global pandemic. And as you know from being here, I come from an experience of deep, deep loss. And I just want to acknowledge that all of us have gone through a very, very tough year with the COVID pandemic. And we've all experienced some form of loss or another. And that varies amongst all of us, right? It could be just the loss of our normal routines or not being able to see our family members. And those are very significant and deep losses. It could be that you've had some financial setback or, God forbid, lost your job. And of course, the worst of all, many of us have lost folks that we know and love due to this insidious and terrible disease. Now, at the same time, I don't know about you, but I've experienced a great deal of silver lining during this period of the pandemic. People doing things for neighbors and one another that we just didn't see highlighted in an otherwise very contentious news cycle and difficult political year. And even in the course of grieving, while we miss each other, we miss embracing and sharing those tears that are so important to support family members, I, like many people around the world, experienced a Zoom funeral here in my own family. And the beauty of that, as it turns out, is that so many people showed up, and showed up literally from all over the world, to honor my stepfather at a time where my mother really, really needed that support. And so it was, again, just a beautiful silver lining in the face of an otherwise very difficult year. So I hope you all are doing okay. And I do see that we're seeing a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel here, and things are changing quickly. So we're here to talk about, again, my book, which I'm having a little technical difficulty, but we'll get through it. It's called My Wife Said You May Want to Marry Me. And it's a memoir in 3 parts. The first part of the book really focuses on the topics of love and family and relationships. The second part of the book is difficult. It talks a great deal about what it's like to be with someone you love at the end of their life, as well as to share some experiences about how to speak to one another when we're going through grief. And the final part of the book, I'm hoping, is really a bit more uplifting. And it focuses on how, in the face of devastating and unexpected loss, one can find resilience in an unusual, unexpected, and challenging way. So let's talk about this story. Part 1. The story starts back in 1989, and that was the time that I was a third-year law student studying for the Illinois bar exam. And a gentleman by the name of Uncle John, both Amy and I called this man Uncle John because John had dated my mother between her marriages when she was divorced. And he also turned out to be Amy's dad, Paul's best childhood friend. And he called me and he said, "There's this wonderful woman moving back to Chicago. I think you guys would get along. You should give her a call." And so I wrote down her name, and even spelling the last name wrong, somehow, some way, during the course of writing my book, as I was scouring for items of my own life, I found the Post-it note, the original Post-it note, which I wrote down her name. And we went on my first and only blind date. Now, Amy famously says at the end of that date that she knew she wanted to marry me. It took me a little while longer, but of course I got to that place as well. And so we began to really be together almost inseparably, kind of right away. But the problem was I had this long road trip planned after going to law school. And so I did that. And she and I communicated in good old-fashioned handwritten letters. And it was a wonderful way to get to know each other, and of course, a window into what it was like to be with someone who was such a gifted writer. And so, like I said, we really did become inseparable, and this is the young version of me with a full head of dark hair, but you can see the joy, the real joy that she and I had together as we began to get to know each other much better. And we did what was now called startup businesses. We started 2 of them, as a matter of fact, even before we were married. And it was just, again, a terrific way to get to know one another and to spend long hours together and see whether we were indeed as compatible as we thought we were. And the first one was a t-shirt business. And Amy was the creative department. I, on the other hand, was pretty much everything else, legal and marketing. And we would make these t-shirts and sell them to catalogs and stores. And it was actually a pretty lucrative business, and it was very, very fun to do with Amy. And the other thing we did was we started a button business. That's right. We would scour flea markets wherever we went and gather these huge buckets of buttons, sift through them, find the best ones, and spend hours and hours and hours together making jewelry. Who knew that we were jewelry makers? But we make these bracelets and brooches and other items and sell them to family and friends and to local markets around the Chicago area. Now, I mentioned that it took me a little bit longer to realize that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with Amy. But about a year after that first date, I conspired with my dad, who had a commercial film studio back then. And I set up the soundstage like a Parisian scene. Paris was very significant to both of us for different reasons. The red and white check tablecloth, the pictures of Paris, a bottle of red wine, some French music playing in the background. And I got down on one knee and I asked Amy if she wanted to marry me. And of course, as you all probably could guess, the answer was yes. And immediately after that, when we were married and went on our honeymoon, I got a real sense of what it was like to live with a writer when we thought about making a list on our honeymoon. And that list we called Amy and Jason Rosenthal's Marriage, Goals, and Ideas. And it was interesting because in preparing to write this book, like I said before, I had sort of gone into all the archives that one gathers during the course of raising children and having a life. And sometimes those end up in storage bins in the basement or whatnot. And as I was looking through one of them, I found this list again. And it really became a thread throughout the course of the book, because even without focusing on it, having it attached to our refrigerator or something, it was a document we made and really ended up living by. And a few of the highlights were dinner time, time to be together. Music in the background is fine, but never TV. Never stop learning, take classes, read, cook, and travel. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And that was really important to both of our lives and our lives together. And this one was important. And, I've heard from so many people since the book came out, whether they've been married for decades or just getting together. And it was to get dressed up and go on dates. And that was really important to us because we wanted to remember who those two people were that fell in love as young people before the chaos of a family began. And it did begin. There was a lot of chaos, but also joy and love as we began to expand our family. And led by Amy's creativity and her whimsy, and just her ability to enjoy everyday life, we had a lot of wonderful, wonderful years together. Which included, as I mentioned before, one of our goals was to travel. And what we ended up doing is, because we recognized that we were in a position where we could travel, which we're so grateful for, but on every single one of the trips that we took with our family, we incorporated some form of social service. And that we thought was a really important set of values to teach to our children. And so here we were in Guatemala after spending a week in an impoverished community building stoves for families. Soon after our third child, Paris, was born, Amy decided to make a pivot. And many of you may know Amy, as a matter of fact, because of her just prolific writing ability. She wrote and published over 35 children's books and several adult books as well. Many of these children's books, you may know, were so successful and appeared on the New York Times bestseller list. And when the kids were little, I took a moment to talk to the boys on one occasion to see what they felt about their mom pivoting to being a full-time writer.
I think she's a very good writer. And I think it's pretty interesting that she's wrote almost 5 books, 500. She's an amazing writer.
Well, they were both right. Justin's correct at the end there when he said she was an amazing writer. And yes, she published somewhere between 5 and 500 books. So, Amy's creativity and her ability as a writer was not just in creating stories, but in seeing words within words, this type of wordplay that I don't know about you, that I just was constantly flabbergasted by. And it became sort of this thing that we would do within our family, all 5 of us, to try to up each other on the ability to wordplay. But when when that young girl Paris became a bat mitzvah, we took the whole family to Israel, and that wordplay continued as we got there. When Amy created a poster that we placed on the outside of the bus that we toured around in together for the week, of course, incorporating wordplay. And I want to give you a sense of what it was like to experience that occasion and talk about it afterwards.
It's all amazing. I feel new. Do you feel new? I understand when they say we're.
So yeah, I just wanted to show you a little slice of what incorporated into our family was the values of love and family and being together and really honoring all of that. So I talked to you a little bit about part 2, and part 2 is a little bit more of a challenging story. When that young woman grew up to go off to college, our lives changed forever, and not in the way that we anticipated. We were so excited about that next chapter of life, that empty nest, that we were really so looking forward to return to those 2 people who loved spending time together, as I talked about before. But we were whacked upside the head on literally the weekend that our youngest went off to college, when Amy called me from a business trip and said, I've been having some difficulty, some pain in my stomach. I called my doctor, and she advised me to have you pick me up from the airport and go directly to the emergency room just to get this thing checked out. It didn't sound normal. This was from a woman who I want to just say to you, after 26 years of marriage, I knew was a very strong person, rarely complained about a headache or a stubbed toe or anything. So this we knew was something different. And sure enough, we discovered that she had a tumor that was most likely malignant and that we were advised to have further evaluated. And I want to take a moment here just to do a public service announcement to tell you that we did find out, of course, that it was ovarian cancer, and many of the signs and symptoms of that terrible disease are similar symptoms that women experienced all the time. So just learn this acronym, look at these symptoms, and if you know anyone who might benefit from it, please let me know, and I'd be happy to send you these cards that our foundation had printed up. As with many cancer stories, ours was a very difficult surgery and chemotherapy, etc. But we had one brief moment of remission during the summer where we threw an epic party and Amy felt like celebrating, and only she could pull off this. I know it's black and white, but it was a lime green one-piece jumpsuit. And it was a wonderful celebration. And I wanted to share a story that I wrote about in the book, because so much of what we see every day is people fighting with one another, whether it's politically or for any occasion, it seems like these days. But my experience, even in the face of devastating loss, is the beauty that came out in the human race. So one evening when we were in home hospice, I went to the store, which is, I was by Amy's side almost 24/7. And so I knew it was going to be a short trip, maybe 20, 30 minutes. And I was walking. And as I came back down my tree-lined street in Chicago, it was dusk and the street lights were on and it was still a little bit light out. And I was stopped dead in my tracks when I saw that on our fence in the front of our house, attached to the whole width of the fence, were these beautiful open, strung up yellow umbrellas, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and this beautiful sign. And what's amazing about that story is that it was an anonymous act. And still to this day, we have no idea who did that wonderful, beautiful act of kindness. Now, many of you probably know Amy as well from an incredible essay that she wrote that was published in the Modern Love column of the New York Times on March 3rd of 2017. And that essay was called "You May Want to Marry My Husband." It was a beautifully, beautifully written essay. And of course, because it was Amy, it was also humorous. And it was really a creative play on a personal ad for me. And incredibly, what happened is that it went crazy, crazy viral and was read by millions and millions and millions of people all over the world. And so my life changed significantly as a result of that essay. And unfortunately, Amy was really not able to appreciate the incredible impact her story had, because it was just 10 days later that she died of ovarian cancer. So part 3 is really what happened to me, to Jason, when Amy and Jason was no longer that one word that it was for so many years. And shortly after Amy had died, I was at a tchotchke shop looking around, and I saw this tile, and I said, wait a minute, I need to buy that, because that really captured quite a bit. And I had to embrace my new life. And as I slowly started to emerge out of that tight grip of grief, the challenging questions that I asked myself were some of these that I include here. And I realized that one must embrace grief and know that everyone processes their loss differently. There's no right or wrong way to flow through this extremely difficult and confusing process. And this became very important, and that is to don't be afraid of talking about your own story of loss, because I guarantee the person sitting right next to you at a dinner table or in a crowded room has their very own version of loss. And this, try, as Amy lived her life and talked about so much, try to appreciate the simple moments that life has to offer, because, of course, we now know, and many of you may have the same experience, that we never know when our last day is going to come. And I love this quote. It says, we need to find a way to talk about both things, the reality of deep, persistent pain and the reality of living with the pain in a way that is gentle, authentic, and even beautiful. And so I began to really find my voice. And that first opportunity came in 2018 when I was approached about the topic of giving a TED Talk about my experience. And I said, all right, I'm going to give this a try and I'm going to write it. And if they accept it as is, then I will tell my story, because at the beginning, I was approached by all kinds of media looking for salacious details, even weeks after Amy died. Is he dating, this and that? And I didn't have any interest in doing that, but I did have an interest in sharing some of the difficult parts of what it's like to be with someone you love at the end of their life. And so when they accepted the script, I agreed. And in April of 2018, I stepped onto the main stage at TED and gave my TED Talk. And it really catapulted me into an area that I didn't really realize was something that was going to be part of my future. And that was to talk about these difficult topics. We don't really address these issues much here in this country. And so I did that, and I began to speak all over the world on the topics of loss and grief, but also about love and resilience. And I found my written voice and wrote a Modern Love column of my own on Father's Day of 2018, which, yes, is the same title as the book that you're here to listen to about today. And I had an opportunity that was incredible, which was to write a book with my daughter Paris called Dear Boy. And that picture book became a #1 New York Times bestseller and was just a thrill and a joy to do with my daughter. And like I said, it gave me, that written word gave me the opportunity to expand that modern love essay into a book that we're talking about this morning. There are two things that I knew I wanted to do just in my gut after I lost Amy. One was to commission a piece of public art in her honor. I really just do believe that she's going to go down as a Chicago icon, someone who really influenced the world of writing and words and film and literature here in Chicago as a representative for the whole world. And so I navigated the bureaucracies of the city of Chicago and the Park District for 2 full years before having this beautiful glass yellow umbrella erected in a public park here in Chicago. If you ever come to Lincoln Park here in the city, come to Grandma's Garden and sit and reflect, read a book, have a picnic, or just contemplate at this area. And this is the whole family celebrating the unveiling. Now, one of the things that I really just didn't know how I was going to move forward with was how to be a single parent to these now 3 amazing young adults. And what I've learned is that we're doing this as a partnership, really. You know, I'll always be the parent, but they've taught me so much as well, and we're experiencing new things. And so during the middle of the pandemic in the summer, Paris and I were asked to celebrate in a virtual graduation ceremony. And I've gotten to know these 2 young men and this beautiful young woman in different and challenging and unique ways. And many people ask me as I've moved forward in this process about what should I say to someone who's going through the process of grief, which has really been highlighted over the past year. And the thing I say, people say, really, is that simple? And in a way it is. Of course, it's much more complex, and I write about it in the book. But the main message is to say something. I know it's hard. And so perhaps the thing you could say is, this is really hard. I don't know how to say what I'm feeling inside, but I just want you to know that I'm thinking about you and I'm here. Really, that goes such a long way. And when you're trying to comfort someone going through grief, don't say, hey, let's go out. Yeah, let's go grab a beer or some dinner. Because that puts the onus on the person experiencing grief. Be specific, set a specific timetable. And if they don't want to or don't feel like it, just try again. And I think this too is one of the main messages, is just to be yourself, be kind, and be empathetic. The second thing I talked about a minute ago is I wanted to start a foundation in Amy's honor, which I'm so proud to say we've done. The twofold mission is, one, to break into that area of early detection of ovarian cancer because there is no test at this point. And the other aspect is child literacy, and that is to get books in the hands of kids who don't have the opportunity to read from a young age, which we know is so important. And so this past October, when we were going to have our second annual event, we also pivoted to the virtual space. And I want to play a quick segment from our virtual program.
Last spring and summer, the organizations Save the Children and No Kid Hungry included some of my mom's books, as well as the book I wrote with her, Dear Girl, in their campaign titled Save with Stories. Here is a short compilation from the project.
Hi guys, my name is Reese, and my friend Jennifer called me and said, hey, would you want to read some stories to some kids? And I was like, yeah, I love to tell stories.
I'm going to read Dear Girl, #1 New York Times bestseller by Amy Krauss Rosenthal and Paris Rosenthal, illustrated by Holly Hatam.
Guess what I'm going to read to you today? I'm going to read Dog Rabbit. This is a story about two very different people looking at the same thing and seeing two very different things. This story is called Uni the Unicorn by Amy Krauss Rosenthal. I love this book. No, the rabbit is so hot he's cooling off his ears. That's the sun, and what's that? Fish.
And if anyone's interested in watching the entire program, it's available on that website. And it was really a wonderful event and a nice success for the foundation. And so here I am, still 4 years later, figuring out what's going to be written on that proverbial blank page. You know, at the end of Amy's essay, she left me a literal blank space at the end. Yes, to find another love story, but it's something that I've used as a metaphor as I proceed forward in my life. And if you have that blank page, I would challenge you. You know, there will be plenty of darkness. Of course there will be, but try to find that light. And loss, as I said at the beginning, can take you to joy. And loss can take you to beauty. And that's the end of my direct presentation. I'm so grateful again that you all have chosen to be with me today. And I know that there will be an opportunity for some questions at this point.
Yes, thank you, Jason. If you have questions, you are welcome to put them in the chat. You can also raise your hand and we can unmute you. I'll get started with a couple questions of my own. This was one of my favorite books that I read last year, so I'm just thrilled that you could join us and could talk to us about it. Were you a writer before you wrote this book? Because it's so eloquent and so easy to read. I know lawyers write a lot, but was that something that you felt called to, like Amy?
Well, that's a great question, and the answer is pretty simple, and that is no. Of course, I did write a ton, but I was practicing law for 30 years, and that type of writing is so different, as you might imagine. Even as you try to infuse a bit of creativity, that's not always the case. I had different creative outlets. I did some painting and other things. But no, this was really, other than the column and the talk that I gave, the first real expanded piece of writing that I did.
That's great. One of the things I'm glad you touched on during the presentation that I thought was really helpful in section 2 were just the different ways that your family and friends really stepped up and were helpful, not only in those last months and weeks with Amy, but also in the time immediately after her death. And you really talk about that it wasn't just your experience and your kids' experience, but that it was the family's experience. Can you talk a little bit about how you navigated that with the entire family?
Well, sure. I mean, what we have to keep in mind, of course, is that this was a devastating loss for me, something I didn't expect. And though we had 26 wonderful years together, I can see that perspective now. We anticipated spending the rest of our lives together. And so this impacted me so significantly. And also this version that cast me into this, public sphere of talking about Amy all the time was very different than what's going on with the rest of our family. And I really had to keep in mind that, these 3 wonderful young human beings lost their mom. And that is something that we've continued to really work on and discuss as a group, the 4 of us, and individually with each child. But the thing is, too, I had this incredible, vast community, and as you mentioned, family that was so supportive. And when I talk about family, I don't just mean my own, but I mean Amy's family as well. We really are just one big group, and they've, from day one, embraced me as their own. And, it's been really beautiful to see that we've still maintained those close connections, both with my mother-in-law and my brother-in-law and sisters-in-law and their families. And so we are, I think, approaching the topic of grief as we move forward in different ways. I'm very public about sharing the experience because of how meaningful that's been to me to talk to different people about it and and to get some really good feedback about that, and others are more private. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. One of the other things you highlight in section 2 was that you were so glad that you and Amy had really had some conversations about preparing for end of life and how she wanted that experience to happen, and also what she wanted to happen immediately afterwards in terms of funeral and remembrance.
Yeah.
Can you just talk about why that was important to you and how that helped in the immediate aftermath?
Sure. One of the things I talk about as I travel around, or sit on my couch, depending on what time of life it um, is to really emphasize to people when they're younger, is to talk about issues that you think might be important at the end of life, because you don't think about it when you're younger, but it does get to a point where it might be too late. And so I've tried to emphasize that for sure. Some of the stories I've heard about loss, obviously, are stories of sudden and unexpected loss where people don't have an opportunity to really dive deep into some issues that may be important to those that are left behind. And yeah, as a result of a long and extended and drawn out illness and some very dark moments, there were also some meaningful and beautiful conversations that Amy and I had about things that I was anxious about. For example, like I mentioned in my talk, how the heck was I going to move forward in parenting these three people when you are literally the best parent ever? You have such incredible connections with all of them. And, Amy assured me that I too had my own close connections with them and that I was going to be okay. And we talked a lot about that. That was so helpful to me. And like you mentioned, we talked about practical things as well. What do you want to do in terms of a service? What kind of religious component? Do you want music? Who would you like, in an ideal world to speak? All of those things were very, very important, I think, mostly for me, because it helped me to take the direction that I wanted things to go for her. And yeah, we were really, really lucky in that way. And not only was I given that incredible gift of that public permission to move forward, but we also had, like I said, that time to work on some things together.
That's so important to do, and to take the time to really have those tough conversations, because nobody wants to talk about death. It's not something that, especially in our society, that we feel comfortable talking about.
Right.
I want to encourage you to continue to put questions in the chat. We have a question here from a new widow. She said, the book was so helpful in processing grief, especially the hospice piece. What advice do you have on how to respond to the "how are you" question? As a new widow heading back to work, trying to figure out a balance of not sharing too much information, but also not pretending that everything is fine and appearing the victim.
Well, I mean, that's a really, really good question, and certainly, different for each individual. For me, I was more of an open book in the sense that I really just said, you know what, today is a really tough day. Um, I've had some good days, and I know things are, that really tight grip of grief is loosening a little bit, but today kind of stunk, and those things are going to happen. You're going to take a couple steps forward and a few back. And I think that experience of dipping back into anxiety and grief is something that you might have to live with for a long time, even to this day. Um, March is a very, very difficult month for me. My anniversary, the anniversary of Amy's death, and then the service, and all of those things come to a head in this month. And those are hard. Those milestones are hard, mostly because people remind you of the event and reach out to you in support, of course. Uh, but really, it's the moments. Maybe you all have experienced this as well. But it's those moments in between when you really don't expect to be blindsided by those feelings of grief on a random Tuesday, or reaching for your coffee and seeing a picture on a Monday morning. Those times for me have been more of a real gut punch. So expect that, and expect that the next day you may find yourself smiling and laughing.
Thank you. I think that's super helpful. I know, I think it has to do with sometimes you experience grief with all your senses. So a smell can just bring you back, and it might make you upset about, something that was a happy memory, but it just kind of triggers something. And like you said, you can kind of prepare for the dates, but those random times that come up, those can be pretty challenging because you don't know when they're going to appear, when they're going to pop up.
That's a really, really good point. And for me, it's also with music. Amy and I were huge music fans. And so you hear a song, you're like, oh my God, it either makes you crush, with feelings, or it makes you happy and makes you smile and dance, so it just sort of depends on how you are on that given moment of that day.
Yeah, definitely. Section 3, you talk a lot about how you process the grief. And one of the parts that I thought was really interesting was you call it refueling your mind and body. Can you talk through some of those steps that you did to refuel yourself after Amy's death?
Yeah, what I didn't realize is that as the primary caretaker for Amy for all that time, I wasn't really thinking about my own health and my own self. It wasn't until I started to emerge from all of that I realized, oh my God, I mean, like, I don't look so good, and I don't feel so good physically. So there was part of that where I really needed to get back to literally, fueling my body, and then also getting back into things like exercise, which was really important for me, and I think important for anyone. And that comes in the form of whatever it is. For me, it was just I enjoy exercise and feeling good about my body every day, and so I began to refocus on that and things that I did before, yoga and other things. And it also, over time, you begin to accept invitations, for example, from friends who reach out to you, are you ready to go hear some music or something? And so slowly, 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 I began to emerge and start to, again, remember that I needed some self-care as well. And I think that's really important for caregivers to keep in mind after someone is gone.
One of the things that I thought was great is you talk about the Heal Jason tour, where once you were ready to take those steps, that you had friends who were, at the ready that said, okay, let's go do this. And you had those experiences, and you talked about the traveling and the music and the things that you enjoyed, and finding ways to find joy in those experiences, either by yourself or with other people, which I thought was really special.
Thanks. Yeah, I before knowing Amy, I was a big, big music fan, and two of us together, and started to develop our similar tastes. And it just loved going to hear live music, and many bands we've seen often in Chicago here, and going to Millennium Park to hear either classical music or current music, and it was just a big part of our lives. And so I began to experience live music again, which for me was just something so good for my soul. And that's what I think you were referring to in terms of that trip to go hear some wonderful live music.
Yeah, definitely. We have a comment here from Nancy. She says, I really felt that the book spoke to anyone and everyone. I liked how you didn't demean people's feelings of loss when they deal with the loss of a pet. And I recommend this book a lot to those people who might be experiencing the loss of a pet.
Thank you.
We have a couple comments here about Amy's legacy. I knew of Amy, obviously, before I read her Modern Love. I read her comment, I read the book, but I didn't realize how much of a prolific writer she really was. I was going to the library and getting books, and I was like, oh, I kept seeing her name in our favorite, my kids' favorite children's books.
Mm-hmm.
Mallory has a question. Did you have any input with Netflix on Yes Day, the new movie? My kids have watched it and love it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. For those who don't know, Amy wrote a picture book with her collaborator, Tom Lichtenheld. It was called Yes Day. And the concept of the book is really pretty simple. It is that one day a year, the kids get to make the decisions, and the parents have to say yes to everything. So much of our parenting is no, it's no, no, no. And this was just a delightful book. And Jennifer Gardner produced and stars in the new film called Yes Day, which just premiered Friday on Netflix. And you know what? A little bit, Jennifer was amazing and really is just such a big Amy fan. And she had done Yes Day, I forgot to insert this, had done Yes Day for many years with her own children before she commissioned, the rights to this movie. And when she did, she contacted me and said, "How can I honor Amy in ways that maybe the public might not appreciate, but would be important for you and your family?"
Oh, that's
And I
so sweet.
really, I mean, I have such profound respect for her in doing that. And so she did insert some little nuggets, she calls them Easter eggs, throughout the course of the movie that many of you may not see, but that we've definitely noticed. And so, in that sense, yes. But other than that, no. I sent it off into the world, and I really trusted her. I really trusted her in telling the story. That was an honor to Amy and to Tom.
That's amazing. I noticed the yellow umbrella pillow next to you, and the art piece that you commissioned was also a yellow umbrella. Can you talk about the significance of that?
Yes, and if you watch Yes Day, that's an obvious one because that umbrella appears a couple times. But yeah, I did refer to it in the talk, and then I didn't expand on that. So thank you for bringing that up. But essentially, it's this, and that is that Amy was not just a writer, and she was also a filmmaker. And so what she did is she did these public projects. Really, her filming wasn't for a commercial project. It wasn't to make money. It was to give art to the community, really. And so she made this film, which was called 17 Things I Made. And she said, the 18th thing we're going to make together. And so come meet me in Millennium Park, which is a big park here in downtown Chicago. And we're going to create things together. And it was that vague. No one knew exactly what she was up to. And she said, I'll be the one carrying the yellow umbrella. And so that afternoon came, and we walked into Millennium Park. She was carrying her yellow umbrella, and as it turns out, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people appeared. And if you YouTube this, you can find it by just Googling her name. But the project was called Beckoning of Lovely. And so we incorporated that yellow umbrella as her legacy symbol, but she also used it throughout the course of her life as well. So that's the story.
That's super neat. That's
Yeah.
so great.
It's
Were
a
there
beautiful,
other, I'm sorry.
It's a beautiful project that I encourage you to watch. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that sounds awesome. When you were going through your grief journey, and you still are, were there certain books or TED Talks that you would recommend to others who might be experiencing grief?
Yes, for sure. And what happened for me is that people recommended, why don't you go to a grief group? And I was like, that's a wonderful thing. And I'm not poo-pooing it in any way. It just wasn't for me. I highly recommend therapy, by the way. Really, really, really helps me and helped me for sure. But that just wasn't appealing to me. So my grief group became reading other people's stories. And even to this day, I'm still finding, wonderful, wonderful books on the topic. And in my book, I include a list, and I'm happy to, somehow share it with your community after this if you'd like. But I do include many titles that were important to me, literally in the body of the book.
That's great. That's great. So now that you are officially a writer, you weren't before, are you planning to write more things?
I've been throughout the course of the pandemic writing different shorter essays and things, and some of them have been published. And I just don't know. I would like to, and I think I might, but the reality is that for me, this is my life. I got so personal, and I don't know exactly what the next project might be, but I think so.
That's great. One of the other things that I loved in the book was Amy's first word was more.
Right.
And in that public art piece, more is written on that umbrella. So
Right.
what more do you envision in your life for your family as you move forward?
Oh, that's a good question. I really like that. Thank you. The reality is I want to experience more of taking those slow steps that Amy talked about and appreciating the simpler moments that life has to offer. She was a she was a really huge fan of the play Our Town. And I had to go back and reread that after Amy had died to remember what it was about that story that was so impactful to her. And of course, many of you may recall that the one of the young characters in that play, who's deceased, comes back into her like 12-year-old self and is observing everybody going around and saying, "Wait a minute, did you see how great that was, or how beautiful that was?" And that's sort of how Amy lived her life. And so I'd like to think that I'm going to move forward doing more of that, and I'm going to take my time and figure out how I can, make a little bit more of an impact in the world. And we'll see where I go for that. And that's going to be my more, I think.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much, Jason, for being here. I think we can all take something from that, as we hopefully are moving on towards leaving the pandemic life, hopefully in the next coming months, finding that more, but also taking the time to remember those simpler moments. I know for my family, there were definitely benefits to slowing down and having the time at home together just as a family. So I think we can all embrace the more and find the joy and fill the blank space. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everyone for participating. I look forward to seeing you all at our next event.
Thank you all so much for hosting me. Take care.
Thanks, Jason. Take care.